Welcome back. I would now like to share a brief video from our Platinum sponsor, LiUNA, before passing the digital podium over to the session sponsors, Coastal GasLink, who will introduce our opening keynote speaker.
Good morning. I'm pleased to be joining you all today from Calgary. Now, I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda. Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Now, just last year, I had the pleasure of speaking at the BC Natural Resources Forum in Prince George. I recall that energy and the excitement in the room, and like all of you, I look forward to when we can all be together again in Prince George at the Civic Centre. Forums like these are always important, but they're even more important now as they foster the connections and the collaboration required to overcome challenges that this pandemic has created. Despite the challenges in 2020, we set a strong foundation for project success together with our team of Indigenous and local workers and businesses. Now, our number one focus has been and remains the health and safety of our workers, their families, and the Indigenous and local communities around us. What has been so heartwarming and inspiring for me this last year has been the way our team has stepped up to the challenge of caring for each other and their communities. We've seen time and time again that we can achieve great things when we work together. Now, I'm confident that this spirit will see us emerge from this pandemic even stronger. Today, I have the great honor of introducing our keynote speaker, who's building an exceptional legacy for British Columbia. His leadership on a number of important policies, such as the creation and implementation of the BC Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, has strengthened the rights and the freedoms of Indigenous families and communities. Like all of us, he's also a leader who's passionate about the management of natural resources. I have no doubt that we will all be enriched by his discussion with us today.
We are honored to introduce the Regional Chief of the BC Assembly of First Nations. Please join us in welcoming Regional Chief Terry Teegee.
Natural Resources Forum several blocks away from Blake Productions, and hundreds that would gather to discuss the issues of natural resources development in British Columbia and in Canada. And quite obviously, as stated previously, we can't do that this year. And it was a year ago that I'm reminded that the issue of land rights was being brought up with the situation with several hundred kilometers away from here to the west in the Wet'suwet'en territory. But I'm also reminded too that that when we are gathered in the Civic Center, it's a good time to discuss many of these issues. And I'd be remiss not to acknowledge Kevin Brown's cowbell reminding us of the next session that is coming up, and certainly miss the ability to hear a cowbell and to remind us of the sessions that were coming up in the Civic Center. So hopefully that can happen in the next couple of years as we see the light at the end of the tunnel. And that tunnel is quite long, despite the fact that we do have vaccines, other technology to detect the disease, and also several other ways to continue to fight this disease from spreading. And it's been 100 years, well over 100 years since the Spanish flu, the pandemic of 1918. And those implements to fight the Spanish flu were really the only things that were at our disposal a year ago. It was to socially distance, wash your hands, wear masks, and stay 6 meters or 6 feet apart and 2 meters apart, and socially distance, self-isolate. Those things and those practices were done well over 100 years ago. And that still stands true today, considering the fact that we didn't know what this disease, COVID-19, would do to people. Needs to be the practice of socially distancing, even though there is a vaccine. So I'm asked to say a few words today in regards to the current situation in terms of First Nations here in British Columbia, and to speak about what is very important to First Nations here in BC and the rest of Canada is the recognition of Indigenous rights through the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Just a reminder, the declaration itself was passed at the United Nations on September 7, 14 years ago, with 144 states that agreed in favor of the declaration, 11 abstentions, and 4 that voted against the declaration, namely Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. And that was very concerning for many First Nations here in Canada, United States, and elsewhere, which required a lot of lobbying. Through 9 years of lobbying, and in May of 2016, Canada announced that it would fully support, without qualifications, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it was a good day for many First Nations in this country. And I'm reminded also, too, that UNDRIP doesn't create new rights for Indigenous peoples. Rather, it recognizes that it is the minimum standard, that it is the minimum standard in terms of recognition of the human rights of Indigenous peoples in this country and elsewhere in the world. Implementing the declaration through domestic law, and as I stated in the legislature well over a year ago, and in November 25th of 2019, an historic day for British Columbia, where the declaration was introduced to the legislature and was really implemented as law. So really it sets out the self-determination of Indigenous peoples and the sovereignty and the recognition for sovereignty for Indigenous peoples. And it's a foundation for our Indigenous peoples to really recognize our true ability to govern ourselves, make decisions for ourselves, and also to have a say in what happens within our traditional territory. Now, as a follow-up, this past year, in December of 2020, a new federal legislation, as in Bill C-15, a federal process has begun in Canada with our partners in Ottawa. And here there's a real opportunity to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples across the country of Canada and recognize that really the declaration was needed to resolve some of the issues, the outstanding issues of the land question that continues to be brought up here in British Columbia. In many respects, some of those issues have been recognized and resolved by the Supreme Court of Canada, such as the Chilcotin court case of 2014, and also past court cases such as Delgamuukw Stayaway really need to be lived up to in terms of the recognition of Indigenous peoples in this province. And further to that, it was here in British Columbia in November 25th, 2019, as we brought this, what is known as Bill C-41 to the legislature in Victoria, was that it was unanimously supported by all parties, not only by the coalition party or the coalition government between the NDP and Green parties, but also the Liberal government also supported the bill to pass. And it was a historic day where we recognized that First Nations human rights to their own affairs and to their own territories. Right now, it's been well over a year, and we are developing an action plan and reporting as a part of a commitment to Bill C-41. The action plan is still in development, and right now we continue to discuss what is important to many First Nations leaders across the province of BC, including the issues of environmental assessment, child welfare, forestry, perhaps healthcare, looking at what is being brought forward by the province of BC to look at the Policing Act is another opportunity to look at how UNDRIP can be brought into the fold with many of these laws that govern British Columbia. There is a non-derogation to protect and affirm inherent Aboriginal treaty rights and title is quite important. That the non-derogation really acknowledges that we have an authority to govern ourselves. Respect for diversity of Indigenous peoples, rights, and territories. There are many First Nations distinct cultures across British Columbia, well over 30 distinct languages, and 204 First Nations communities. So quite a diversity here in British Columbia, and it's important to know and understand that we're all distinct amongst each other, and that we have different ways of knowing and being. A duty to align provincial laws with UNDRIP, requiring new steps for legislative initiatives and review existing law, policy, and practice. This is really important in terms of how the province engages First Nations in terms of the laws that govern the lands of British Columbia. And it has to acknowledge that First Nations have a say, whether it's development or laws that govern our children and our social fabric of our First Nations across this province. And it requires the province to make all necessary measures to go far and wide to acknowledge and accommodate our First Nations peoples across this province. It's important to make space for consent-based decision-making with Indigenous governing bodies and provincial authorities, and really to implement the provision within the United Nations Declaration of free, prior, and informed consent. This is probably one of the most important aspects of the United Nations Declaration for Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is the ability to have a say of what occurs within our respective traditional territories. And there needs to be confirmation and the need to consult and cooperate with our Indigenous peoples, as it states in Article 38 within the United Nations Declaration. Really, these provisions are not only for government to implement, but it's of British Columbia, but for the federal government, municipal governments, and I would say that private companies do have the necessary ability to also implement the United Nations Declaration, and perhaps private companies need to think about how are they going to acknowledge and implement the declaration within their policies, within their relations with Indigenous peoples? And I believe that companies that are thinking ahead to implement such things as the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and also the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples as part of their policy is going to be well ahead of the curve. And business planning and decision making. The global pandemic has really hit everyone in this world very hard. We've seen literally in this province billions, in this country billions, and the world trillions of dollars that have have come out of really the economic development of many countries, and the downturn in the economy has been felt by everybody, and for Indigenous peoples and for the poor in this country and in British Columbia have really felt it the worst. Consent-based processes need to be developed as we move forward in terms of business planning, such as seen in Section 7. I think this is really important for companies to consider as you move ahead with different opportunities here in British Columbia, is to gain the consent of Indigenous peoples for projects that you are proposing. And as I said, free, prior, and informed consent is a tool for business predictability, and also to have an ability to have some level, as the business community would say, certainty, and to think that companies and First Nations to come together and make these decisions together, everyone's the better for it, including government. And the application of Indigenous legal orders. Indigenous legal orders includes the ability to govern ourselves and to make decisions within our processes in British Columbia with our respective Indigenous territories, to recognize that there is a legal order. And what is paramount is that First Nations is one of the highest legal orders to gain consent and First Nations blessing on many, really I think, developments that are being proposed in British Columbia. The role of rights holders and implementation, Indigenous governing bodies, is really important to understand that many First Nations have different ways of governing themselves. Just for example, myself, as an Indigenous person from Takla Lake First Nations, we have a potlatch system where we govern ourselves within our clans, and many others have different ways in British Columbia. And it's to better understand that, is to get to know the First Nations of how they govern and how they make decisions versus stakeholders. We are not stakeholders, we are decision makers. We can no longer be pigeonholed as one of the stakeholders. It must be understood that we are decision makers within our respective territories. And with that, I just want to thank you to all, and we are not through this very difficult time in the pandemic. It's a long tunnel, as it were. There is light at the end of the tunnel. There is a vaccine, and we still need to socially distance and continue to practice the protocols of socially distancing, wearing masks, and self-isolate. To all the First Nations that have lost loved ones, our prayers are with you. To the well over 1,154 that have succumbed to this disease in British Columbia, our hearts, our minds are with you. And to those that have either are continuing to battle this disease or have recovered, the well over 62,000. Certainly our thoughts are with you, and as we move forward, we can do it better together, and as we make decisions together, First Nations and the society are better for it. We need to also acknowledge that there has been a real reckoning in this province and in this country and in the world, that the minorities, that the socially compromised, if you will, or the poor have really raised their voices in terms of social justice. And we need to acknowledge that there is some semblance of a reset, I would say, in this country and in the province of BC and in the world. And perhaps here's an opportunity to really reset the conversations with Indigenous peoples, minorities, and others that have really felt the detrimental effects of this disease. And I wish you well. There is, I believe, session 3 with former Chief from Tsawwassen First Nation, Kim Baird, Chief Harvey McLeod, Chief Corina Lewin, and Nanwakila's Councillor Dallas Smith coming up in session 3. And we'll have further discussions about First Nations involvement within the natural resource sector. So I wish you well. Masicho, thank you very much. Masi.
Thank you so much, Chief Teegee. Now that concludes our first keynote address of the morning. Please return to the agenda and select the next session to view the live stream, Panel 1, Economic Recovery, a Cross-Sector Perspective, sponsored by Summit Earthworks. And don't forget to have your questions ready and input them into the Kuva Q&A for our panelists today. Thank you to our Q&A sponsor, Jambo.